This happened when my family lived in Knoxville, in a neighborhood that was still being built out. There were finished streets with nice houses, but a few roads over there would be empty lots with construction equipment sitting around for months. My parents bought that house when I was in elementary school. It wasn't huge, but compared to the townhouse we'd lived in before, it felt enormous to me. My younger brother and I each had our own rooms upstairs, which was a pretty big deal back then because we'd shared one before. My parents' bedroom was downstairs, along with the kitchen and living room, so once everyone went to bed, the second floor felt surprisingly separate from the rest of the house. I wasn't one of those kids who got into trouble much. I spent most afternoons doing homework right after school because my mom wouldn't let me watch TV until it was finished. That rule probably helped more than I appreciated at the time. After homework, I'd either read, play on our old family computer in the little office downstairs, or go outside until dinner. My brother was the complete opposite. He couldn't sit still for more than 10 minutes and was always coming home with scraped knees or ripped shirts from climbing somewhere he shouldn't have. My dad worked. His hours were pretty regular except during storms when lights would go out all over town. My mom worked too. Neither of them had jobs that followed them home, which I didn't realize was kind of nice until I got older and started hearing about people answering work emails all evening. People knew each other well enough to wave from driveways. Kids rode bikes until it got dark in the summer. Every now and then somebody's dog would get loose. And the neighborhood Facebook page didn't exist yet, so everyone would just walk around asking if anyone had seen it. Around the time this happened, school had just let out like 2 weeks earlier. My brother had already started sleeping until almost noon every day, while I still woke up early because I couldn't seem to break the school schedule. I remember spending a lot of mornings upstairs in my room with the windows open because Tennessee summers weren't unbearable first thing in the morning yet. My room faced the side of the house instead of the street. If I leaned toward the window, I could see our neighbor's backyard and a small stretch of woods farther back. I wasn't especially social back then. I had friends, but I was perfectly happy spending a day by myself. My best friend Lily lived about 15 minutes away, so we mostly saw each other during school or if one of our parents arranged it ahead of time. One thing I remember really clearly from that summer was how much time my parents spent fixing little things around the house. It was still fairly new, and they were determined to make it feel more like theirs. Every weekend there seemed to be another small project. One of those projects actually involved the roof. A few shingles had lifted after a storm earlier in the spring, and a roofing company came out to replace them. I only remember that because my brother spent half the afternoon standing in the driveway watching the workers climb around like it was the coolest thing he'd ever seen. After they finished, I don't remember anyone ever mentioning the roof again. As far as we knew, there wasn't anything wrong with it. It was a weekday because my dad was at work and my mom wouldn't be home until around 5. My brother had gone to a friend's house after lunch, which left me home alone for a couple of hours. That wasn't unusual anymore. I was old enough that my parents trusted me to stay by myself as long as I locked the doors and didn't answer them for strangers. After eating, I carried a glass of iced tea upstairs because I wanted to finish a book I'd borrowed from the school library before it was due back. Our upstairs hallway was simple. My room was on one side, my brother's across from it, and the bathroom at the end. You could hear almost everything happening downstairs because the staircase opened right into the living room. That afternoon, the house was quiet. I think I'd been reading for 30 or 40 minutes when I heard what sounded like a dull thump above me. I waited a few seconds, heard nothing else, and went back to reading. Another sound came. This one lasted longer. It sounded like several footsteps moving across the roof. I remember stopping to think about it because squirrels usually sound lighter and quicker. This sounded heavier than an animal. I got up and walked into the hallway because I thought it would be easier to hear from there. This time it wasn't directly over my room. It sounded like whoever it was had moved farther toward the front of the house. I wondered if one of the neighbors was somehow on our roof doing something. That didn't make much sense. I walked downstairs first because my initial thought was to look out the front door window. I checked. Nothing. Everything outside looked normal. Before I even started back upstairs, I heard it again. Only this time it wasn't walking. Someone running. Footsteps came one after another across the roof. Our house was 2 stories tall, and the roofline wasn't something a person could just climb onto from the ground. I went back upstairs because the window in my room gave me a better view of one side of the roof than anything downstairs. I wasn't expecting to see anyone. I mainly wanted to prove to myself that there wasn't anything there. When I got to my room, I remember moving the curtain aside and leaning close to the glass. From that angle, I could see part of the roof over the front porch and a section that sloped toward our driveway. Something moved so quickly that my brain didn't process it right away. A person. He came over the edge of the roof head first. Not climbing. He literally fell over the edge. I realized he wasn't wearing any clothes. He was completely naked. That image is still unbelievably clear in my head because it made so little sense that I remember staring instead of reacting. He hit the ground hard enough that I expected him to stay there. He rolled onto one shoulder immediately. It looked painful. His legs sort of tangled underneath him before he pushed himself upright. I remember seeing him stumble once, like his knee almost gave out, but then he caught himself. The whole thing probably lasted like 4 seconds. It was fast enough that I didn't even think to scream until he was already on his feet. He never looked toward my window. At least, I don't think he did. His head stayed down like he was focused on getting away from the house more than anything else. He took off running across our side yard toward the woods behind the neighborhood. I can still picture how strange it looked because he wasn't carrying anything and obviously wasn't wearing anything either. It was broad daylight, maybe a little after 3 in the afternoon, and there was just this completely naked man sprinting across the grass like someone was chasing him. I called my mom. I don't remember whether she told me to call 911 or if she did it herself afterward. Our side yard had mostly grass with one small flower bed near the corner of the house. The grass was flattened in one area and a couple of the plants had been crushed. That was about it. My dad also walked around looking for a ladder because he couldn't figure out how someone would have gotten onto the roof. There wasn't one. None of our neighbors remembered seeing anyone carrying one either. As far as I remember, they looked around the wooded area behind the subdivision for a while. Before that happened, we were the kind of family that sometimes forgot to lock the back door until bedtime. Afterward, Dad checked everything. My brother was disappointed that he'd missed everything. That's such a younger sibling reaction. For weeks, he'd ask me to tell the story again because he thought it sounded exciting. I remember getting irritated with him because it didn't feel exciting to me. It just felt confusing. He eventually stopped asking after my mom told him to leave it alone. Years later, when we were both adults, he admitted he used to lie awake wondering if someone was going to end up on the roof again. I never knew he'd been thinking about it too. If it had happened repeatedly, you could start building theories around it. Instead, there was just this one completely bizarre event that never connected to anything else. As an adult, I've gone through every explanation I can think of. Maybe someone was under the influence of drugs and somehow climbed onto the roof from a nearby tree, although there weren't really any branches close enough to make that easy. Maybe he'd been hiding somewhere and panicked. Maybe he came from a neighboring roof, but the houses weren't close enough together for that to seem likely. I've wondered if he was running from someone. I've wondered if he had a severe mental health crisis. I've wondered if he was injured before he fell, and adrenaline just kept him moving, and how he ended up naked on top of a 2-story house in the middle of the afternoon. My mom still remembers the phone call. She says she knew from my voice that something had genuinely scared me because I wasn't crying. I was talking so fast I couldn't finish a sentence. I never saw him touch a window. I never saw him look inside. For all I know, he didn't even realize I was watching him. Whatever he was doing on that roof seemed to end the moment he lost his footing. I was living in Pennsylvania. The house belonged to my aunt originally, and when she moved into an assisted living place, my parents helped me rent it cheap because I was trying to save money. I had graduated a couple years earlier, worked a few different jobs that never really went anywhere, and eventually settled into maintenance work. The backyard was bigger than you'd expect for that area. There was a chain link fence that ran around most of it, except the very back, where it just kind of opened into a patch of woods that connected to an old cemetery. You may ask why anyone would buy a house next to a cemetery, but it wasn't as strange as it sounds. The cemetery wasn't active anymore. It had technically been closed for decades. My dad used to take me with him to clean my grandparents' graves every Memorial Day, and I guess after doing that for years, they just felt like quiet places. I never believed ghost stories. I still don't think every strange thing automatically has a supernatural explanation. Most evenings after work, I'd end up outside in the backyard. My friends came over sometimes on weekends, but during the week it was mostly just me sitting outside scrolling through my phone or listening to baseball games on the radio. If the weather was decent, I'd stay outside until 10 or 11. If I'd been someone who stayed inside every night watching TV, none of this would have happened because I never would have been looking in that direction. From my backyard, you couldn't see the entire cemetery. The trees blocked it. There was just one stretch where the ground dipped slightly, and the older headstones were visible between the trunks. At night it looked darker than the surrounding woods. Once there was a fox that kept showing up for almost a week. I'd never seen one that close before. The cemetery wasn't hidden behind iron gates or covered in fog like movies make them look. During the fall, people actually took pictures there because the maple trees turned bright orange. It was just another part of the neighborhood. The first strange thing happened toward the end of September. It was somewhere around 10:30. I was wearing a hoodie. I happened to glance toward the cemetery because I heard branches snapping and saw someone walking. The person wasn't anywhere near my fence. They were farther back among the graves where the ground opened up between the trees. The only reason I kept watching was because they were carrying something. I wondered if it was a bucket. Whatever it was looked perfectly round. It just sort of hung beside the person's leg while they walked. The moon was out and I could tell someone was there. The person looked like a man from what I could tell. Dark clothes. Walking slowly but not unusually slowly. Just steady. No matter how long I watched him, my eyes never seemed to focus on him completely. I knew I was looking directly at him, but he always seemed just slightly unclear. Like every time I thought I had a good look at him, I'd realize I couldn't actually describe his face. He stayed between the older graves. After maybe a minute, I lost interest. I picked up my empty soda can, unlocked the back door, and went inside. I rinsed the can out because I usually recycled them, turned around, and for whatever reason looked back out through the kitchen window. The cemetery was empty. I stepped back outside because I thought he'd walked behind one of the trees. No sound. The area wasn't huge. If he'd continued walking in either direction, I should have seen him. One Friday, my younger sister came over to borrow my ladder because she and her husband were repainting their guest room. She joked that my backyard looked depressing because all you could see beyond the trees were old gravestones. The second time I saw the man was completely different because this time he wasn't far away. It was late. Not as late as before, a little after 9. I'd fallen asleep on the couch after work, woke up feeling stiff, and realized I'd forgotten to take the trash cans out to the curb. I walked into the kitchen, grabbed the garbage bag, and happened to look toward the window over the sink. I thought someone was standing in my backyard, closer to the tree line. Whoever it was wasn't moving. I leaned closer to the window because the reflection from the kitchen light made it hard to see outside. I realized the person was facing the house. Even then, I wasn't frightened yet. It didn't make sense for somebody to be standing back there staring toward my kitchen. I switched the kitchen light off so I could see better through the glass. The backyard immediately became much clearer. The person was still there. Dark clothes again, standing almost exactly where the trees started. I couldn't make out his face any better than I had the first time. One arm was hanging lower than the other, like he was carrying something. The same round object. This time it looked bigger. I remember standing there trying to figure out if it was a motorcycle helmet. That was my best guess. It had roughly the right size and shape. I don't know why somebody would carry a motorcycle helmet through an abandoned cemetery at night, but it made more sense than anything else I could think of. After watching him for like 15 or 20 seconds, curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed the flashlight I kept by the back door and stepped outside, mostly thinking that if it was some neighborhood kid messing around, shining a light at him would probably make him leave. That night it felt strangely still. I called out, "Hey, can I help you?" Nothing. Not even a reaction. He remained standing there. At that point, I still thought it was someone intoxicated or somebody who had wandered over from another street. I started walking across the yard, mostly because I wanted to know who was standing on the edge of my property. The closer I got, the more I noticed the object hanging from his hand. It wasn't swinging. That was the first thing that really registered. If you carry something by your side while you're standing still, it naturally moves a little whenever you shift your weight. This didn't. It just hung there. I stopped. The flashlight wasn't pointed directly at his face because I was trying not to blind whoever it was. It landed around his chest and arm. I was saying again, "You all right?" Still nothing. He wasn't standing stiffly like a statue. His clothes moved a little in the breeze, so he obviously wasn't some decoration or tree stump I'd mistaken for a person. But he wasn't responding like any normal person would. The beam landed on what he was carrying. It looked exactly like a human head. A head. The skin looked pale in the flashlight beam. Dark hair, the face angled downward. I remember seeing what looked like a closed eye. It wasn't detailed enough that I could identify anyone, but it absolutely looked like someone's head hanging from this man's hand. I thought it was incredibly realistic Halloween decoration. It was late September, almost October. Stores had decorations out everywhere. People bought all kinds of things. As ridiculous as it sounds now, my first thought was literally, why would someone be walking around with that? The man slowly lifted his head, not the thing he was carrying. His own head. He looked directly toward me, and once again, I couldn't actually make out his face. The flashlight was on him. Nothing blocked my view. But if someone asked me today whether he had a beard or glasses or how old he looked, I couldn't answer. It's like every feature refused to stay in focus, even though everything else around him was perfectly clear. I remember taking another couple of cautious steps, because I was trying to figure out whether this was some kind of prank. I looked back down at what he was holding. This time, the face was turned slightly more toward me. I could see enough to know it wasn't plastic. At least it didn't look plastic. It didn't have the exaggerated appearance that Halloween props usually have. It looked normal, like an actual person's face. It even had a slight shine to the skin from the flashlight. I was standing in my own backyard looking at a man who appeared to be calmly holding what looked exactly like a severed human head. If that had actually been true, you'd expect panic, running, someone yelling, blood, something. But instead everything was still. The entire situation felt wrong in a way that's difficult to explain, and this happened that I still can't make sense of. The man didn't walk away. He didn't turn. He didn't duck behind a tree. I was looking directly at him, and my hand shook. Then he wasn't there. There wasn't enough time. Even if he'd sprinted into the woods, I should have seen movement. That was when I finally got scared. The kind of fear where your body decides you're done with whatever you're doing. I backed away without taking my eyes off the tree line until I reached the patio. Once I got inside, I locked both doors, closed every blind in the house, and spent probably an hour walking from one window to another looking outside. I didn't sleep. For the next few days, I avoided looking toward the woods. I kept the kitchen blinds closed. I started sleeping badly. At first, it was just waking up around 3 or 4 in the morning for no reason. Then it became harder to fall asleep. I'd lie there feeling completely exhausted but unable to relax. The best way I can describe it is that I constantly felt like someone else was in the room. There was this persistent sensation that I wasn't alone. It wasn't even always frightening. Sometimes it was just heavy, like the room somehow contained another presence that wasn't visible. Even lying in bed, I'd sometimes feel as if somebody had just sat down near my feet without the mattress actually moving. I'd find myself opening my eyes just to reassure myself the room was empty. Of course it always was. My appetite disappeared. That surprised me more than anything because I'd always been the kind of person who ate whenever food was available. For almost 2 months, I mostly lived on coffee, toast, and whatever I could force myself to eat during lunch breaks. I became tired all the time. The strange feeling stayed with me for months. There were evenings when I'd be watching television and suddenly have the urge to look over my shoulder because I'd become convinced someone was standing behind the couch. Nobody ever was. Sometimes I'd be in the shower and feel like someone was waiting outside the bathroom door. Again, nobody. It got to the point where I was embarrassed by my own reactions because they weren't based on anything I could actually point to. It was just that constant feeling that something had attached itself to me after that night. I decided to move. I was ready to leave that place. The odd thing was that within a few weeks of moving, I started sleeping normally again. I was 17. It's been over a decade. This happened in rural Indiana. Once you got a few miles outside town, it turned into nothing. If you've ever spent time in that part of Indiana, you know what I mean. During the summer, the corn gets so tall that you can barely see over it from the road. My friend Miles and I had grown up there. If we wanted something to do, we usually had to come up with it ourselves. Miles lived with his mom and younger sister about 15 minutes from my parents' house. His dad had left years earlier, so his mom worked long hours at a nursing home, and Miles pretty much looked after himself most afternoons. My parents were still together, but both worked full-time too. My dad drove trucks for a farm company, and my mom worked at a doctor's office. During the summer, they were gone most of the day, so unless I had football practice or was working, I usually ended up over at Miles's place. Neither of us had a driver's license yet that summer. We both had permits, but our parents weren't exactly volunteering to let us practice every day. We mostly got around on bikes or just walked wherever we felt like going. I think that's probably why we explored so much. We weren't trying to be adventurous. We were just bored. There were a lot of abandoned places around us if you knew where to look. Most weren't actually abandoned forever. Sometimes a family had moved away, or an old farmhouse was waiting to be demolished, or someone owned the property but hadn't done anything with it in years. We never broke into houses or stole anything. Honestly, we were both too nervous to do that. We'd usually just walk around outside, look through broken windows, and leave. We thought stuff like that was interesting because it broke up the routine. It wasn't like there was a mall nearby or anything exciting happening in our town. My first job was bagging groceries at a small supermarket. I worked evenings a few days a week, mostly to save money for my first car. Between the two of us, we probably made enough money for gas if we'd actually had cars. I'd sleep in later than I should, ride my bike to Miles's house around lunchtime. We'd find something stupid to do for a few hours. It was a simple time. We both had flip phones that mostly stayed in our pockets because texting cost money. If one of us wanted to find the other, usually ride over to their house and knock on the door. It was sometime in August. The corn was already fully grown. I got to Miles's house around 1 in the afternoon. His mom was asleep because she'd worked the night shift. Miles was sitting on the porch. He asked if I wanted to go check out an old property he'd heard about from another kid. Apparently, there was an abandoned RV somewhere near a back road a few miles away. Nobody knew why it was there. That alone wasn't enough to convince me, but Miles said it was supposed to be way back behind one of the cornfields where hardly anybody ever went. That sounded different enough that I agreed. We cut across a couple gravel roads and eventually followed an old drainage ditch that ran alongside several farms. We weren't trespassing on purpose. At least I don't think we were. Around there, property lines weren't always obvious unless there were fences. After like 40 minutes of walking, we found what looked like an old access path between two huge cornfields. The grass had grown over most of it, but tire tracks were still barely visible underneath. Miles figured it led to where we wanted to go. The farther we walked, the quieter everything got. Eventually, the path curved toward a small patch of trees. From the road, you never would have guessed there was anything back there. The RV came into view by accident. It was tucked just beyond the trees where the corn opened into a little clearing, maybe the size of 2 basketball courts. It looked like it had been sitting there for years. One side leaned lower than the other because the tires had gone flat long ago. Most of the paint had faded into that dull, chalky white old campers get after sitting in the sun forever. One window had been broken, and another had been covered with plywood that had warped from years of rain. There wasn't another building nearby, just this old RV sitting by itself with weeds growing halfway up the sides. From the outside, it just looked abandoned. The door wasn't even completely shut. It hung open like 6 inches, like the latch no longer worked. I remember expecting the inside to smell terrible, but it actually wasn't as bad as I thought. Mostly mildew, the kind of smell every abandoned building seems to have. There wasn't much furniture left. A little table, some cabinets hanging crooked, an old mattress toward the back that looked stained from years of water leaking through the roof. What immediately caught my attention, though, was the walls. There were adult posters everywhere, not just 1 or 2. The walls were practically covered with them. A few had completely faded from the sunlight coming through the broken windows. It was honestly strange more than anything else. It wasn't the posters themselves. It was the feeling that somebody had spent a lot of time living there. There were empty food cans scattered under one cabinet, blankets piled in one corner, plastic bottles. It looked less abandoned than we'd expected, like someone had left in a hurry instead of cleaning out. I noticed some things sitting underneath the bed frame. I don't want to describe them. They weren't normal things people accidentally leave behind. There were stains on a couple of items that I tried not to think about too much. Miles asked me what I'd found. I just looked back at him and said, "Let's just go." He came over, crouched down, looked under the bed, then stood right back up. We'd wandered into a place that belonged to someone we really didn't want to meet. Miles quietly said, "Yeah, let's get out of here." Neither of us touched anything else. We just turned around and headed back toward the door. I remember stepping down onto the dry grass and taking a deep breath without really thinking about it. The inside of that RV, it felt personal, like we'd accidentally walked into the living space of somebody who wasn't quite right. I think that's the best way I can explain it. Miles looked back toward the doorway for a second and said, "Let's just head back." We both heard an engine. It got louder. It sounded like whatever it was had turned onto the same dirt path we'd used. Miles stopped walking and looked toward the trees we'd come through. "Did you hear that?" he asked. The engine kept getting closer. A few seconds later, an old pickup truck rolled into view between the trees. I couldn't tell you the model now. It was one of those older American pickups from the 80s or early 90s. It wasn't in good shape. It had come from deeper in the woods. There wasn't another road back there that we'd seen. It was almost like the driver knew exactly where he was going. The truck slowed as soon as it entered the clearing. I figured we were about to get yelled at for trespassing. That seemed embarrassing, but not terrifying. The truck stopped. The driver sat there for a few seconds with the engine still running. I couldn't see his face. Miles said, "Maybe we should just apologize." That still seemed like the most likely outcome. The driver's door opened. The man who stepped out looked like he was somewhere in his 40s. I mostly remember how rough he looked. He had a heavy beard that hadn't been trimmed in a while, dirty jeans, work boots. He looked from us to the RV, then back to us again. He stared, long enough that it became uncomfortable. I took a step forward and started saying something. I don't even know if he heard me. His expression didn't change. He climbed back into the truck without saying a single word. The engine suddenly revved. The truck lurched forward so fast that both Miles and I froze for half a second because it didn't make sense. He wasn't turning around. He was driving straight at us. I remember Miles yelling my name. I don't remember consciously deciding to run. Instead of following the open clearing back toward the access road, we instinctively cut toward the trees because it was the closest place a truck couldn't easily follow. The pickup bounced across the uneven ground behind us. When I glanced over my shoulder, it was still coming. There wasn't any question in my mind anymore that he was trying to hit us. He missed Miles by what couldn't have been more than a few feet. Close enough that Miles stumbled trying to get farther into the trees. The truck couldn't fit between most of them, so it finally stopped just inside the tree line. I remember grabbing onto one of the trunks because I was completely out of breath already. We were waiting to see if the truck backed up. The driver's door opened again. The man climbed out. I saw a knife. I hesitate to call it a knife because it was larger than what I usually picture. It looked more like something you'd use for clearing brush or processing animals. The blade caught the sunlight. He held it down by his side and started walking toward us. Miles looked at me and said, "Go." We turned and ran deeper into the trees. Those woods weren't very large, but they were thick enough that running wasn't easy. There were fallen branches everywhere, patches of thorn bushes, and vines that caught around your ankles if you weren't paying attention. The trees blocked almost everything. He was moving steadily, still holding the knife. It felt impossible to figure out what was going through his head. We kept weaving through the trees until the woods started thinning out. I suddenly recognized where we were. Earlier that summer, Miles and I had crossed this same little wooded area from the opposite direction. That realization probably saved us. Instead of trying to think about where the roads were, we already knew there was a narrow creek, like another 100 yards ahead, with an old drainage culvert running underneath a county road. We ran straight for it. Football practice had kept me in decent shape, but running flat out through woods is completely different from running laps on a field. We reached the creek, knee-high. Neither of us even slowed down. The water splashed everywhere as we crossed, and we scrambled up the muddy bank on the other side. We ended up walking home using the roads instead of cutting through fields again. It took forever because we kept looking over our shoulders every time we heard an engine. When I got home, my mom asked why my hands were scraped up. I told her I'd fallen while walking. I knew the first question she'd ask was why we were wandering around abandoned property miles from home. We didn't know exactly whose property we'd been on. By the next morning, both of us had started wondering if we'd somehow made the situation worse without realizing it. We never went back, not once.